If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people, share your frightening experiences involving otherworldly woods, portals in the woods, fairy circles, missing 411 phenomena, lost time, abductions, etc. Some background: I live in South Wales. I drive all over the place for fun, but last night I came across something I'd never experienced before as I drove through Brecon. 2:34 was the time on my radio. I felt weird and not good. I rounded a bend to see a tall, skinny man standing in the middle of the road, no torch, no lights, whatsoever. As my headlights hit him, he just grinned at me, looking straight through me, and bolted into the woods that were surrounding me. It normally takes me 30 minutes to drive through this part of the mountains, but when I got out on the other side, my radio was saying 512. I have no explanation for this, and it's starting to get to me. Anyone else had similar experiences? So me and my younger brother are roommates. We live in one house, and we only have a couple neighbors, but most of the land is just woods. Recently, we have been hearing a lot of strange sounds. It started with what sounded like screaming, but it seems to be getting weirder. Tonight my younger brother was hearing what he can only describe as some kind of music, but something otherworldly, and yet the screaming still occurred. He thinks whatever it was might have attacked some dogs. From what he says, the dogs were all going crazy. Any guesses? We haven't seen it, but it's not human. Nor is it a mountain lion. We live in Alabama, and there aren't any here. I must have been 8 or 9 when this occurred. I grew up in a small rural community in the South. I would spend the long summers at my grandma's house, making forts out of abandoned chicken coops and playing in what felt like an endless forest. A lot of strange things happened during those summers. This is just one of those occurrences. I had gone out on my own into the woods that afternoon. I just had to be back before it got dark. I had run a different way this time. I got lost. I remember it not being scary, just unfortunate. I had come upon what looked like a dried-up riverbed. I followed it for a while. I had never seen it before. It was deep, at least up to my head. It just snaked on and on. I thought maybe it'd lead me back to somewhere I recognized. It didn't. Instead, the ground thundered. It felt like 1,000 horses were charging. There were many drums beating at an unnatural tempo. I heard shouting. I couldn't understand it. It wasn't any language I'd heard before. Screeching. It was terrifying. I didn't know where it was coming from or why it was happening. I curled up in the ravine. I was hiding, but I didn't know from where. The excitement had passed, and I had the nerve to climb out. There was nothing. It was silent. All of the sounds one would expect to hear in the woods had just evaporated. This was almost as chilling as the horses. I felt like something was chasing me. I didn't belong there. I just ran in one direction. I had come out of the small barn behind my grandma's home. I was screaming when I found her. She didn't seem surprised and didn't discredit my experience. It's like she knew. I had never pressed her further on it later in life. I wish I had. I tried to find that riverbed a few years later, but to no avail. To this day, I still have no explanation for what happened in those woods. I do know that whatever occurred was not natural. I was around 16 or 17 when I was driving around with my friend. We were on local, rural roads, and it was after dark, maybe around 9 p.m. surrounded by fields. I saw something out of the corner of my eye, on the passenger side, maybe 15 to 20 feet out in the field. It was like a dark circle on the ground, and 3 people came out of it, all in separate directions. They didn't crawl up like it was a well, it was like air pushed them up, and their knees didn't bend, almost like a pop-up book. And they started walking in separate directions. My friend and I just kind of looked at each other and were like, "Did you see that?" I had no idea what we witnessed. I was afraid to turn around and go back and check, but now I am curious as to what we saw. Late one night, I was driving home on the highway around 1 to 2 a.m. The moon was out, but it was cloudy, so the sky was that dark gray color. I remember looking up while I was driving and seeing what looked like a black garbage bag stuck on a telephone wire, blowing in the wind. But I remember thinking, that's odd because that line would be way too low over this highway. I had driven that part of the highway hundreds of times. I was driving at about 60 miles per hour, and the black blob wasn't moving. As I got closer, I noticed that the black garbage bag was moving in a more fluid motion than a bag blowing in the wind. It looked like a blob of oil hovering in one spot. Kind of like a lava lamp. It also kind of looked like the robes from a Dementor in Harry Potter. This was a few miles from a huge outlet mall in Chicago, Illinois, Chicago Premium Outlets, and I was the only car I saw driving in both directions. I was lost in thought for a few seconds after, trying to comprehend what I saw. I didn't feel any fear, but I was really mind-f trying to put together what I saw. It was definitely the oddest thing I've ever seen in my life. First and foremost, holy shit, I haven't told this story to many people since I have second-guessed myself over the years, but after reading a story that had dramatic similarities, I figured I had to tell it. Dudley Town is real and is not to be ducked with. I went there back in 1999 with Greg and Dave after fishing the Housatonic River all day. It was late afternoon, and we would probably have a couple of hours to explore before it got dark. Back around this time, you could still park at the trailhead and walk in easily. I've been there twice, and the first time I went in through dark entry. This time, I decided to take the Bald Mountain entrance. On the hike, it got eerily quiet, and we kept hearing a dog barking that never showed, even though its sound kept getting closer. We walked off of the trail near the well in the center of town and were surrounded by thousands of frogs on the ground everywhere. They were all over the ground, and no matter where you stepped, you were either stepping on frogs or having them leap at your legs. Nearby, a shadow darted off into the woods, spooking the hell out of me since the sun was facing in the opposite direction, thus creating shadows opposite the one we saw. Between the shadow, the dog, and the frogs, we decided to leave. I jokingly yelled, "Dudley Town is bullshit. Duck this place." Teenage idiocy. On the way out, our footprints on the trail were freshly wiped clean, and "help me" was written in the sand. I assumed Greg or Dave did it, but we were together the whole time. I got goosebumps, feeling as though something was watching us. Mind you, I grew up in the woods, and my family had a primitive hunting cabin in Goshen that I spent a lot of time at. I'm no stranger to being alone deep in the woods, but this place just felt off. After leaving and getting home, I went to sleep and woke up violently ill. Profusely vomiting and unable to keep anything down, I went to the doctor. After multiple tests, the doctor said I had a strain of food poisoning that he had never seen before. I was put on a liquid diet for a week and lost 15 pounds about 2 weeks later. I felt better and never had any recurring issues related to it. Now, I am definitely a cynical skeptic and don't believe in fairy tales and ghosts, but for the life of me, I cannot explain or make sense of that day other than something supernatural that occurred. There are no animals in Dudley Town, little sun breaks through the trees, and there are known caves that go miles below the surface. I used to work with a guy named Bruce who lived in Kent, and he told me there are 100 stories like mine. He told me of seeing a child run off into the woods as he drove by Bald Mountain Road at night. I recently brought this up with Greg and Dave, and they both remembered it exactly the same. Dave said he went back once because paranormal activity is a curiosity of his, and more happenings occurred as well. Orbs and crying sounds kept moving in the woods. Dave as well as myself are avid outdoorsmen and would recognize, say, a coyote or an owl. He said it sounded alien or demonic. Either way, after 18 years, all three of us remember it exactly the same. From the dog to the frogs and the shadow to the "help me" written in the sand. Oh yeah, and they both were adamant that neither of them wrote in the sand. They both asked me if I did, which I sure as hell didn't. I no longer live in Connecticut and here access to Dudley Town has been prohibited, but there is definitely something strange about those woods. A few nights ago, I went outside to see my dog. This would be about 11 or 11:30. I saw some lights moving around behind my house, and I'm pretty far out there. I don't have any surrounding houses nearby. The lights looked like someone, or maybe more than one person, walking around, then the lights just went off. I thought, hey, maybe traffic from far away? Bright headlights or something? I dunno. So 2 nights ago, my dog was barking like crazy. I looked out the window and saw someone with a flashlight. I grabbed a gun, just in case, and made a lot of noise trying to open the door. But the guy runs away into the woods, and I grabbed a weak flashlight because I'm retarded and don't know how to change batteries or something, so I didn't get a good look at him. Last night, I saw more lights moving around. They looked like 3 or 4 flashlights. Well, I decided to check it out in the morning. So about 7 a.m. Central Time, it's 10:40 as of now, I went into the woods, gun loaded just in case, and did some exploring. Probably around 8:30 to 9 a.m., I had pretty much explored the whole area. I went back around looking for maybe markings or something. Found nothing. Not a freaking thing. So apparently there's a guy, or guys, traveling around and stalking me? Or maybe not? I don't know, but it's pretty terrifying. I don't know if I'll have plans to investigate again, but I will definitely keep an eye out and see if they come around. In November 2014, one of my good friends and I were talking about a hike through overgrown woods about a quarter mile away from my house. It was about 10 p.m., so we relied heavily on flashlights. As we were walking through the thicket of brush, I had a weird feeling in my stomach, not that I was in harm's way or feeling like I was being watched. Something in my mind just clicked and said, "Look up now." When I looked up, I saw a pair of eyes, just white eyes, or at least this was the reflection of my friend's weak flashlight. So I looked at him and told him to stop and look at this with me. I had borrowed a very high-powered flashlight from my father when I would walk with people at night, so I instinctually turned the light on and shined it in the general direction of the eyes. What I saw was interesting. It was very similar in appearance to a pit bull, but much larger with no fur. When my light hit it, its eyes turned a more greenish-yellow color. It snarled at us without growling, and my friend and I took a few slow steps back. After this, it silently turned around and walked away. My friend was convinced that somebody lost a dog, but I kept telling him, that wasn't any dog. A better description, think of a dog similar in features to a crop-ear pit bull. This thing was double the size. It had no fur, just matte gray skin, which was very veiny. This thing had very impressive muscle mass. It had a black nose and, of course, yellow eyes. I've ruled out a lot of possibilities, mange, hellhound, etc. I'm just wondering if there's somebody who knows what it could have been or has had an instance similar to my own. I live in the Dominican Republic and love to take my dogs on walks around the hundreds of trails in our area. 2 days ago, we went to a new trail in the evening to catch the sunset. It was one long path with tons of bikers and noticeably smaller paths on either side. After walking for about an hour and seeing an amazing sunset, we turned around to go home. After walking down the path we came in on for a while, we came to a clear Y in the road. I didn't remember seeing this earlier and had no idea which way to go. I also noticed that I hadn't seen any bikers in a while, but I thought maybe that's because it was getting late. My dog wanted to go to the left, so I let him lead. It didn't take long for the path to get extremely dusty, a terrain we never encountered on our first walk. We turned back and took the path on the right instead. At this point, it's getting dark, my phone is low on battery, and it has no service this far out, so I'm getting a little worried. We walk for a while, but I don't recognize any of it. By now, it's pitch black, and my phone battery is being drained by the flashlight. I accept defeat and look for a place to hunker down overnight with my dog, who is very tired and thirsty now. We had been just sitting for a while and listening for someone to walk by when my phone screen lit up with a notification. I had service in this spot, but only 1% battery. I quickly called a friend and told them what was happening. I dropped my current location to them and just waited. They showed up, and I was so relieved. I explained everything and asked them to take me to my car, but they hadn't seen it. We backtracked from the main road to find the parking lot, and there it was, 6 kilometers away from where they had found me. I go on walks and hikes with my dog frequently and never struggle to find my way back. I can't help but think something strange happened out there. It would be very unlike me to get that far off the path, especially in that amount of time. Nonetheless, I'm not going back there. The Grim Reaper Forest. This is not what the actual forest is called, but this is what I call it. Let me start from the beginning. I was never one to believe in the supernatural or ghosts. To me, they were nothing more than fairy tales, and no fairy tale ever got as much attention as the Grim Reaper Forest, said to be the place where many wrongdoings happened, murders, and reported UFO sightings, and it is said that many people who enter this forest never return, as if this forest was a portal to somewhere else, malicious and reality-bending in nature. This place is said to warp and bend the minds of those who enter. Even the trees that live there are twisted and knotted in unsettling ways. But I was young and had something to prove. I wanted to show people that these were just stories, just fairy tales. The sky was clear and sunny. The plan was simple: go in, find the center, and get out. There was nothing more to it. So there I am, standing outside, ready to enter and see if the rumors hold true. The inside of the forest mists up ever so slightly. I enter, walking deeper and deeper, welcomed by the sound of leaves crunching underneath my boot. I continue to march forward. The deeper I went, the more and more unsettled I felt. As unease washed over my body and I began to feel nauseous, I continued to walk and felt a squish between my boots instead of the usual crunching. I looked down, and my heart dropped. I was met with a face, a half-decapitated head that was rotted and pale, patches of maggots covering his cheek and forehead, and colorless eyes looking to the sky. I stared at them in a trance, unable to stop looking. Then one of the eyes moved and glared over at me, the other one followed, and pure fear coursed through my veins. I ran back where I came from as fast as I could, but even though I ran in the exact same direction, I couldn't find the path I came from. The forest was covered in a thick mist, and all directions looked the same. I couldn't see anything besides trees, as if the forest had pulled me in deeper and deeper without my knowing. I heard whispers around me, then, all of a sudden, a scream, then another scream from the same direction. The screams continued, and I carefully walked towards where I heard it coming from, but the closer I thought I was getting to the source of this screaming, the quieter the forest felt. Without my knowledge, the forest was slowly pulling me in, little did I know where it was leading me. The forest grew darker, and colors slowly began to fade. A misty gray and brown consumed the forest, and the trees started to change in appearance too, losing their leaves the further I went. All around me were leafless trees. They looked dead but felt sentient as they swayed, blowing in opposite directions to the wind. This place was unnatural. Uphill felt easier to walk, and downhill, the places with the most sunlight seemed darkest, and if I ignored the sound of screaming I was following, the place was completely silent, like it was muffled. I screamed, but sounds didn't seem to travel at all out here. I couldn't even hear the scream leave my mouth, it was muted. But there was no turning back now that I had already come this far and felt compelled to go further. The screaming stopped, and in front of me was an open space and a concrete plate in the middle. The trees stopped growing there, nothing seemed to be growing there. I walked towards the center of the plate, and as I got closer, my senses started to spike. Things became unbearably bright, I heard intense winds brush past my ears, and the earth began to shake violently. As soon as my foot touched the center of the plate, everything went dark and silent. I think I slipped into another dimension by accident. What happened was that I was visiting an old friend who moved away a few months ago. It's a 1-hour drive, usually when I stay on the highway without any problems. That day was a drive with problems. On the way up, it took me 2 hours already because a truck had an accident. After spending time with my friend and his wife, I drove back home. I had to work the next day, otherwise, I would have stayed, as they offered me a bed. The highway was still partly blocked, so I took a detour through the woods. That route takes half an hour longer than usual, but as the highway is partly blocked, this half an hour is quicker. It was night, and the street wasn't that busy because not everyone knows their way around these parts. After half an hour, my fuel indicator lit up. I forgot to refuel, so I had to take another detour. It has gotten darker, the radio wasn't working, but my radio has had issues for quite some time. I found a tank station, and God knows why, I spoke in a language I don't know. The gas station worker understood me and spoke the same language. At that moment, it wasn't even remotely weird, I don't know why, if I were possessed or just running on autopilot. When I left the station, it seemed to be almost pitch black, my headlights weren't that bright, yet I drove as if nothing weird was happening. I heard a few high-pitched notes until suddenly, as if a switch was flicked, everything was back to normal. I was scared because I suddenly realized what had happened. Hell, I almost pissed myself because I thought I was going crazy. The remaining drive was normal, and I fell asleep instantly as I got into bed. Something like this has never happened before. My last few weeks were stressful, but I wasn't sleep deprived or on drugs. I didn't even drink a beer with my friends because I had to drive. Has someone some explanation? Can a human be so into autopilot that reality seems to change? This happened to me some years ago, I believe in 2014. My boyfriend and I are fashion and nature photographers. We would often take trips to a local butte in our area to photograph sunsets, as well as the frequent wildfires that went through the area. One evening on the butte, we got into an argument over something stupid. I can't remember what it was at this point, likely something dumb about camera settings. And I stomped off a couple 100 yards away, like a brat, to sit under a big tree that's right at the top of the butte. Anyway, we got into a huge argument, and I stomped off. I walked for maybe less than a minute towards the tree, and I started to feel uneasy out of the blue. I got out of my own little angry world, looked around, and noticed it was far past sunset. I hadn't remembered it being very dark, it shouldn't have been. We were there specifically to photograph the sunset and had arrived a good hour in advance to mess with the camera settings, and the sunset hadn't happened yet when we initially arrived. We had gotten into our dumb argument right as we arrived. If that helps, I sort of tried to brush it off, like, maybe I was so upset I hadn't noticed. But I knew, in the back of my mind, that it wasn't really possible. We had been there for minutes, not an hour or more. At the entrance of this butte, there are bear and cougar warning signs, so I was feeling really dumb and scared at this point since I was alone and it was suddenly basically dark. Neither of us had a cell phone on us, and I thought to myself, more or less, this is childish, I'm going back. But when I walked back, my boyfriend wasn't standing where our argument had occurred. Even if I had stomped off in the past, it was really unlike him to also stomp off and just leave. So I ran back down the hill as fast as I could to see if he had gone to wait in the car. By the time I got to the bottom of the hill, it was pitch black. His car wasn't there. For reference, even if you're a really slow hiker, This hill only takes around 10 minutes to go up or down at walking speed. We had come there in the same car, so my ride was gone. My house was only a 20-minute walk away, and having no cell phone, I started walking. I encountered my mom's car halfway through my walk. She was furious, saying I had been gone for hours and that my boyfriend was beside himself, freaking out at home, and that he'd combed the entire butte looking for me. She drove me home. Both my parents and boyfriend claimed I had been gone for over 3 hours. I honestly thought they were joking with me to scare me until my dad started yelling, which is really abnormal compared to how calm he normally is. He isn't the type to joke, either. They had even called the police, wondering if I had been abducted. In my mind, from the moment I had stomped off from my boyfriend, I had been gone no more than 16 or 18 minutes at the absolute most until I ran into my mom, who had driven to find me. To this day, I don't know what exactly happened. I am an open-minded person, but I'm also skeptical. Why were all of our passages of time so different? What could have possibly occurred? I have no clue what happened this day, and I really would love to know if anyone has any insight in the slightest about this. I've experienced quite a few paranormal and strange things in my life, but this was for sure one of the weirdest and most confusing that I can't explain. When I was in primary school, my grandma lived near a cane field. My cousins and uncle lived in the same town, while my mother and I lived further north, so on school holidays, my mom would take us down to visit them, and I would primarily stay at my grandma's house. My cousins would then stay there to visit me. Because of factors like childhood neglect, we kids would be left home alone at night while our grandma worked, and my mom and uncle would catch up with friends and then go drinking. We thought we were cool because we were about 10 to 12 years old and could literally do whatever we wanted. One of those things was my cousin smoking. She wouldn't smoke in the house, so she would go outside and smoke by the boundary, which was directly across the road from the cane field. She came back inside, sobbing, and her sister or I asked what was wrong. She told us there was a thing crouched behind a bin in the yard, and it growled at her. The sister and I thought it was probably a dog, so we went outside to chase it away. However, whatever it wasn't a dog. When we went outside, we could see part of this white thing hiding behind the bin. My dumbass whistled at it and confidently walked up to it, thinking it was a scared or lost dog. I could hear this growling that sounded nothing like a dog but this weird throaty noise. I went closer to it because I still thought in my heart that this thing was probably a dog, until I saw a white knee and saw that this thing was crouching on 2 legs. It was white, with no hair, long limbs, skinny, and humanoid. The closest I can describe it is the Rake. It stood up briefly and made this defensive yell where I covered my face, my cousin screamed, and the thing bounded away on all 4s back into the cane field. We told our parents when they got home, and they joked that it was probably the landowner's inbred son that they let out at night. Because of the underreaction from our parents, we kind of forgot about it over time. However, when we told our grandma one time, she said that one evening when she and her boyfriend were reversing out, she took a wrong turn or hit something, I can't remember, so they both got out, and this white thing was laying flat by the cane field as if it were trying not to be seen. It crouched down lower when they looked at it, and because it terrified them, they pretended not to see it as well, then slowly crept back into the car, pretending it wasn't there. Before the house was sold and during my early high school years, when my mother would take me to see my cousins and uncles, I saw glimpses of it mainly at night, although you could sense an eerie feeling from the cane field during the day. The times I saw it, I started doing this thing where I would walk around at night listening to my iPod, when they first came out. So when I was at my grandma's house, I was wandering around the yard when it crawled out from under my grandma's house, then ran back into the field. I would see glances of it from behind bushes or peeking out of the cane at night, so I stopped going outside at night. Whatever it was didn't try to attack us, though it seemed to be like chilling at my grandma's house. My grandma often worked at night, so I think it went there to sleep or observe things, but it didn't realize me and the other meddling kids were going to find it or notice it. I don't know where it came from or what it wanted, yet I asked my grandma because the town was near a rainforest with several caves around. It's speculated that it would come down when the cane was up to venture around the town. When I was growing up, there were a few forests around town that had famous stories linked to them. The people believed that the forests were cursed by the Native American tribes, who were relocated from their homes way back when. They said the forests belonged to them, and when you go in and go past your gut feeling, those people die in those woods. When my dad and my sister and I moved when I was around 13 or so, we moved to a small town. Across the street was a hill, and at the top stood a blue water tower. I used to hang out in the woods across the street from my house. It was quiet, and the birds always chirped. Other kids were scared of the woods, but I went up there to draw and listen to the birds. Also, because it was at the top of a hill, I could look out, see the entire town, and feel the breeze. But when the animals went quiet, it was time to go. When the school year started, I found out it was an ancient Indian burial ground. Every year, our class would go up the hill and learn about it in the town, and the school was actually really respectful of the forest and the hill. We took care of the trees there. If you looked at the ground, you could still see a lot of Native American arrowheads. We never took them home, though, or were not supposed to. I didn't, at least. I would actually go into the forest when I was walking home because the bullies were too scared to go in. I felt safe there, but I also had to remember to respect it. In the forest, we also had wood piles. When we would go into the forest, we would make piles for the local foxes to nest in the winter. One time, when I went to school after retreating into the forest from one of my bullies the other day, a couple of my classmates came up to me, and one said, "What did you do to Jacob?" I looked at the kid and said, "Nothing, why?" They looked at each other and said, "Well, something scared him, and we thought you scared him in the woods." I said, "I didn't scare him, I just went to hang out up there, that is all." That time Jacob threw a rock at me, and I remember it landing to my right. I hurried up my pace in the woods, and I thought he left the woods at that point like he always did. He screamed raccoon at me, and when I reached the top of the hill, I cried and went home because, for some reason, the bullying hurt. Whatever happened to Jacob in the woods, I will never know. He stopped bullying me that day and said sorry to me, saying that it would never happen again. He did say something happened in the woods, but he never said what or who, but he had a look of terror and practically begged me that he was sorry. I told him it was okay, and I went on my way. He could never look me in the eye again. That was back in middle school. When I went to college, I saw him at a July 4th college event. I was going to catch up with him about life and put the bullying behind us. He glanced, but he still looked uneasy, so I simply walked by. Also, sometimes my sister would walk home with me after school. Only once or twice do I recall. Every time we entered the woods, she felt lost. I even had her lead us, and she couldn't follow the trail. It was like she kept seeing these invisible trails that went in circles. She started to take a heavy breath and cry, saying we were lost. She had an anxiety attack and just told me she had to get out of the woods. I was totally chill and knew the forest pretty well. Then she let us out, and it was easy. It was literally just 3 trails. One from the south, one from the north, and one going up the hill to our house. You could get in and out of the forest in under 10 minutes, from one side to the other. When I was 9 in 1979, my father's company assigned him to Thessaloniki, Greece. For some reason, they housed us in an apartment complex on a hill in the middle of nowhere. Back then, it's more built up now, near the Allied Cemetery. This despite the fact that his office was about an hour and a half away and my school was about an hour away. Though beautiful and wooded, I was miserable. I could neither read nor speak Greek, and most of my neighbors spoke little to no English. You can only enjoy the woods and a historical cemetery for so long before it all becomes old hat. It didn't help that the only things on TV and radio were Greek language programs. Worse, there were no computers or internet back then. Yes, this all happened during the Jurassic period. By the time the company moved us closer to civilization about 6 months later, however, I had made a few friends, thanks to one of my teachers who lived in our complex. Fast forward 1 year, I'm now 10. It's summer, and I'm in Panorama, almost an hour's drive away from my old place. All my English-speaking friends are in their home countries or elsewhere, and I'm stuck with no one to speak to. My few, barely, English-speaking Greek friends are exhausted with English and are hiding from me with others who have the decency to speak fluent Greek. Just before 1 p.m., my neighbor, and babysitter, shoos me out of her house while she prepares baklava, or something. I walk around aimlessly, and about 10 to 15 minutes later, I realize I'm lost. Normally, I can see the hill where I once lived. Now, I can't. In fact, I can no longer see any houses at all. My first thought is, gosh golly. Is this a park? Fancy that, I never knew there was a park this big nearby. After a few more minutes of walking, my second thought is, goodness, this place looks familiar. I keep walking, and my third thought is, ooh. That building looks awfully like where we used to live. Damned Greeks and their unimaginative architectural tastes. A woman with shockingly bright orange hair is walking her dog ahead, and my fourth thought is, that looks awfully like Mrs. Triantafilou. It was Mrs. Triantafilou, my teacher and former neighbor. I look at my watch, it's about 1:27 p.m. Dad was a devoted diarist who got me into the habit, you understand? Mrs. Triantafilou doesn't believe I walked there from Panorama. She runs around looking for my parents, waiting for them to come out of hiding because it's such a wonderful surprise. Had she known we were coming for a visit, she would have prepared something. Anything. Problem: no parents. She finally calls my dad at around 1:50 p.m. because my mom's in Athens and no one's picking up the phone at my place. Dad's not happy to get the call, especially since he was at work an hour and a half away. My neighbor was still cooking when Mrs. Triantafilou drove me back home at around 4 p.m., because no Greek can let you go without first stuffing your face. My neighbor didn't even realize I'd been missing. I insisted lunch ended at around 1 p.m., thereby partly confirming my story, so that's something. But no one believes me. Babysitter last sees me at just before 1 p.m. Mrs. Triantafilou confirms she saw me at around 1:30 p.m. I did not hitchhike. I did not hop on a bus. There was no public transportation to our old place back then. I was not kidnapped and dumped near my old place. Don't think aliens were responsible, because if they were, that was a rather quick abduction. I still don't know how it happened, but it did happen. Has anyone else had a similar experience? Strange encounters in the woods. I have a couple different ones to share here. I used to be homeless. Returning home, I stayed in the graveyard where my grandpa was buried. There was an open sepulcher that was once used as a storage place for caskets. The racks were still in there. I used to sleep underneath them. I always felt safe in there, though. There was one time, the last night I ever stayed there, I awoke to strange voices, and the room had filled up with frogs. I'm talking at least 20. I kind of viewed that as time to leave. Another time, at another graveyard, I found myself camping one night. Just before I fell asleep, I watched a glowing orb float down from the treetops. A couple of years later, I found myself once again homeless. This time with my girlfriend. So we got a tent and went out into the woods. I stayed from October through March of last year. We were never bothered by anyone. It was peaceful, albeit very cold. So one night, there was this heavy feeling in the air. Cops showed up at our camp. They were there on a suicide call. It was the middle of winter, and someone had jumped into the river. Very sad. That night, I dreamed of this middle-aged guy hanging out with us in our camp. He let me know that he was the guy who had taken his life. Anyway, it could have been the power of suggestion, but eventually I read it in the paper, and certain details matched up to my dream. Not exactly paranormal, but I figured I would share. The creepiest encounter I ever had in the woods. It goes way back to when I was in 8th grade. My buddy had property in the country. Somewhere along the way, he got it in his mind that there was something living in the woods, some kind of creature. Likely due to some strange bipedal tracks that the neighbors had found. Anyway, being teenagers, of course we camped out and tried to find evidence to see if anything was out there. It always felt like we were being watched and followed. Footsteps, glowing eyes, etc. The happiest night was when we walked to this large, fenced and electric power line tower. We picked up sticks and started banging on the fence because we found some weird hair on it. So we figured we would make a bunch of noise and see if it would attract anything. Nothing came, and we soon lost interest and walked back to his house. Deciding to just stay in for the night. So we had just made it back to his house when, all of a sudden, we started hearing this clanging noise. Something was at the tower, hitting the fence the same way we had been. It sent chills up our spines. My dad grew up in the 1970s in a wooded area in Maine. It was a tiny neighborhood, with woods surrounding the outer part. My dad had all sorts of unexplained activity in his mother's house, but this is the one that stuck with me. My dad was around 9 or 10. He couldn't sleep. Right beside his bed was a window, and he could easily look out of it from his bed. He heard noises outside, and he got excited because he thought it was a moose or some wild animal. So he whipped open the shade. There was no moose. Looking back at my father, he was a little boy his age. Maybe a bit younger. He wasn't sure exactly what he was seeing, it was very foggy. But it was undeniable that he was looking at a little boy. A little redhead boy, with overalls on and one of those stupid propeller hats. My dad wanted to close the shade and pretend he never saw him. But he just couldn't look away. The boy smiled and waved and began to walk away, making it harder for my dad to see. Eventually, the boy disappeared into the fog. It was dark, and there was thick fog. It was easy for my dad to convince himself that he imagined the whole thing. I think little kids find it easier to convince themselves that nothing happened, they just have an overactive imagination. That's what adults always tell children anyway. My dad was over at a friend's house a few days later. They were outside, shooting BB guns, normal kids in the 70s freedom type playing. The friend's dad was working on a car. My dad tells his friend the story, thinking they would both laugh at how silly my dad was. My dad told the friend, and the friend's eyes widened, and he lost color in his face. The friend books it over to his dad. My dad panics a bit, thinking the friend was telling his dad that he was trying to scare him, and my dad would get in trouble. The boy tells his dad, "Dad. Dad. He saw the boy with the funny hat too." So I live in New Hampshire, and typically during the summers, me and my buddies go up to the mountains and go camping. Last summer, I got invited with a new group of friends to go to a new place I had never been to before in the northern part of the state. The first day went by kind of normally, with lots of drinking. But on the second night, one of my buddies, let's call him Robert, started telling a story about something that happened at that very campsite. Apparently, he and his brother were walking around the site at night and went to hang out by the lake that's nearby the campgrounds. While they were walking towards the lake, they saw a lady in a white dress. As they approached, the lady apparently turned towards them and stared at them. The boys, for some reason, kept walking toward her. After getting maybe 2 feet to the lady, she begins to chase them. The boys made it back to the site and apparently lost her. As Robert was telling this story, I started to get an uneasy feeling and started to see rustling in the woods, but I assumed it was a critter. I just thought the feelings were to be attributed to my being unnerved by Robert's story. After sharing a few more stories, we went to bed. Now here's where things got a little weird. To understand this next part, you have to understand where we all slept. There were 4 of us. Robert slept in a tent across from me and another friend, let's call him Jay, that night. Our other friend, let's call him Thomas, was freaked out because we kept teasing him about bears in the area. According to Thomas, at around 5 a.m. the next morning, he saw Jay walk out of the woods, stand in front of our tent, stare at the entrance to it for a couple minutes, then turn around and head into the woods again. Jay is the type of guy to play a prank on Thomas like this, but the problem is that Jay never left the tent that night, and if he had, the sound of the zipper would have woken me up. We played it off like Thomas was seeing things, but honestly, the whole thing kind of unnerved me. This is something that happened to me almost a year ago. I was 17 at the time and totally not prepared for the terrifying encounter I'd soon be a part of. So a little backstory, a few years ago, me and my family moved from our neighborhood home to a farmhouse in the middle of hay fields and woods to take care of my now dead great-grandfather, who lived there. Since I was such an imaginative kid and loved being outside, I would spend all day out in the fields and woods. Every single day. And I've still done it for all the years I've lived here. To give an idea of the layout of this farmland, our house is in the front hayfield, then there are 2 more behind it with a creek running through, and finally a couple miles of woods behind all that. It was evening, and I went out to the back field to watch the sunset, as usual. The view was best there, and the sunset always looked cool over the trees. I took the 15-ish minute walk on the gravel road that connects all our land. Through the gates, over the creek, past the pond, and finally into the back field. I watched it set over the trees until I couldn't get a view of it anymore. It was starting to get dark, so I decided to go back home until I saw something. On the other side of the field, right across from me, I saw what looked like a buck staring right at me. And while it's not abnormal to see a deer out there, it is odd that it didn't get spooked by my being out there. Since my mom hunts in those woods, I got my phone out to take a picture of it to show her. But the sun had basically set, so all you can see in the picture is a silhouette. That's when it started getting weird. I looked up from the picture and saw the silhouette change. It got taller. Like the deer stood up on its back legs. And I just stood there. Motionless. For way too long. Feeling uneasy but trying not to get scared, I casually put my phone back in a pocket and started walking home. It was getting quite dark, after all. And it's just a wild deer. Nothing to be scared of, right? So I turned my back to the deer and began walking. But something felt wrong. It's like I could feel someone staring at me. Or thing. I quickly look over my shoulder. But I see nothing. It was very dark now, so all I would be able to see was a shadow, anyway. I saw nothing. Until I saw something. The deer. But it was wrong. So wrong. Just typing this out is making me uneasy. It was still standing upright. Just like it was before I started walking home. But it was running. Straight towards me. That's when I knew something was wrong. This isn't normal. And I better start running. I sprint through the first gate and get onto the gravel road. I was screaming for someone to help me. My bare feet are getting torn up by the sharp rocks I'm running over. Fumbling with my phone as I ran, I called my dad. Who was thankfully home. Hello? Someone is chasing me. I don't hesitate to tell him, obviously. Especially since the deer is gaining. It was about half the distance away when I first saw it running. I can hear my dad on the other end of the phone slamming the front door open and running outside. But I can't hear or see the thing behind me. It's black and dark out now, and all I see is a shadow getting 50, 40, or 30 feet away. I tear through the creek bed as I run through it, finally seeing my house lights in the distance. I scream as loud as I've screamed in my entire life. I breathe, scratching my lungs as I do so. I'm running uphill now, not stopping once this entire time. And I finally see my dad in front of me running even faster than I am. He jumps the last gate separating me from my house and starts yelling. Get away! Get away! Get! When he finally reaches me, instead of stopping at me, he keeps running past me and keeps yelling. I fall to the ground, barely able to catch a breath. Tears are streaming down my face. After maybe 20 seconds, my dad kneels next to me. Did you see it? I forced it out of my trembling lungs. I don't see anything. Apparently, whatever chased me was afraid of my dad, because once he was in view, it ran away. He is a pastor, so if this was a demonic spirit, it makes complete sense that it left once my dad got to me. Now it's been a year since that happened. I'm made fun of by most people because everyone thinks it's just a sickly deer with rabies or something. Even my parents. But my great uncle, who is literally an expert on wildlife, says there's no way. He says it was most likely a bear. But a bear hasn't been seen near here for 30 plus years. And I don't think bears have antlers. What happened was so strange, so bizarre, and so much like fiction that I wouldn't blame anyone for not believing a word of it. However, I will just tell it bluntly as it is. It was 2017, and I had been dealing with some difficult issues that had left me depressed. By this time, I was feeling better because the issues were resolving, but a lingering depression remained even after the tough times had passed. I had this idea that I wanted to take a trip to Virginia, specifically to see the Blue Ridge Mountains and take a break from my usual surroundings. I also had some friends living there, so I wanted to catch up with them. A buddy of mine lived in a wooded area south of Roanoke. He had a guest house where I could stay for a couple of days. We had fun reminiscing, playing video games, and having a few drinks. You know, just the usual stuff. The cool thing about his location was that it was quite secluded, and especially lush and beautiful in the late spring when I was there. During my stay, I took some hikes through the woods, simply choosing a direction and following where I felt drawn. I only hiked during the day. Now, I'm going to start describing the experience, and I must say, there are many aspects that are hard to describe. I am doing my best to put into words something that is utterly alien and bizarre. On the second day at my buddy's house, I decided to take another walk through the woods, just as I had done before. It was a serene, almost meditative experience, allowing me to let go of my thoughts and focus on my surroundings. At one point during my walk, I had an intense sensation of crossing some kind of boundary. It was like waking up from a dream, though I was clearly not asleep. I wasn't really paying attention to anything specific, but after this shift, I felt almost jolted and looked around. Nothing was the same. The trees were still trees, but they looked different. The first thing I noticed was the branches, covered in fuzzy black things that moved like electrical or energy wisps. For whatever reason, I sensed these were creatures, not inanimate objects. Then I started noticing the sounds. There was a distant, deep, vibrating noise that undulated back and forth. It wasn't musical, but it constantly changed, somewhat like a person talking, though it wasn't speech at all. That's the best way I can explain it. So there I was, focused on these creatures zooming around a tree branch, hearing this noise. I didn't feel like I was unable to move, but for some reason, I didn't move. It was extremely weird because I had no idea when I had stopped walking. I was walking, and then suddenly, I was standing still, observing and experiencing these phenomena. Then, for the first time, I shifted my gaze to what was in front of me, and I saw what looked like a geometric pattern in the woods. It was like those fractal patterns, except the forest and everything around me looked like a pattern, yet everything remained distinct at the same time. As this was happening, I felt several things. It had become much colder, like standing in front of an open fridge, yet there was no wind. However, I felt a warmth coming from behind me, like the sun or a large heat lamp shining on my back. I could also see this light coming around the corners of my eyes. Then, an idea popped into my mind that I wasn't seeing the real world but rather looking at a giant screen. As soon as I had that thought, everything returned to normal instantly. After this experience, to say that I was freaked out would be an understatement. However, I have some skills in maintaining self-control under pressure, so I decided to walk back to the house as calmly as I could. I tried to convince myself that I was having a vivid daydream, recalling how I used to run around and imagine things in my childhood. After some time and distance from the event, I've become less reliant on self-defense mechanisms like lying to myself. I know whatever that was, it wasn't just a daydream. I still have no idea what happened, and nothing like that has ever happened to me before since that day. I've lived in a small town in Kentucky for my entire life, and because of that, I've been surrounded by the mountains and the woods for years. My current house is literally nestled into the woods in the middle of nowhere, and thus outdoor activities have taken up a huge chunk of my time, especially in the summer and fall. I'm in the woods almost daily, hiking to the creeks to fish or meadows to hunt, and I know the woods and trails around my home like the back of my hand. That said, there is definitely something that calls to you while you're in the woods, especially when you're alone. My parents began allowing me to hike alone when I was around 13, but I didn't get really into it until about 2 years later, when I was 15. Even then, though, I wasn't allowed to go very far, and I always had to carry a walkie-talkie with me so I could contact my family if necessary. Later, at 17, I'd be allowed to carry a handgun with me, but that's neither here nor there. There are stories I can tell at that age too, but this one takes place when I was 15. Before I get into it, I should mention that I have 2 outside dogs, Max, a black lab, and Bo, a beagle. I've had both since I was very young, and they're super smart, always staying by my side when I'm in the woods. They always listen to me, until this day. I was hiking a trail that runs up beyond my aunt's house, one that I'd hike day in and day out, just out and about, enjoying the woods. It was in October, so the weather was cool, not hot, and I had been hiking for around an hour. The trail comes out of a spring that runs down from the top of this particular mountain. It hadn't rained lately, so the spring was mostly dry and covered in leaves. I remember looking up the mountain, which I'd never hiked to the top of before, and feeling this strange call. It wasn't really a voice, but it was an urge I couldn't ignore. Keep in mind that I'm a very timid person, and hiking unfamiliar trails on my own freaks me out to this day. But that day, all my fear had dissipated. All thoughts left my head. I just climbed higher and higher. My dogs followed me. I don't even know how to describe the feeling that came over me, but I remember just staring down at my feet and feeling at peace as I climbed. There was a moment when I paused to look out at the houses below. I'd never been that high up, remember, and I felt amazed. I took a picture on my phone, and then I looked around me for my dogs. Bo had already run off, and Max was following. I called out to them frantically to stop, but they didn't listen. They disappeared. At this point, looking down the mountainside, I was very afraid. Then I looked back uphill, and it came over me again. I kept hiking. I couldn't stop. Eventually, I heard my walkie-talkie crackle. Everything was distorted, and I couldn't make any of the words out. I assume now that I was just out of range for it to pick up, but back then, it freaked me out. Whatever had come over me lost its hold on my mind. My dogs were still gone. Panicked, I began running downhill. It's a wonder I didn't get hurt. As I neared the wide section of the spring, near the bottom, my walkie-talkie picked back up, and I heard my dogs running downhill behind me. I got home, and I mostly forgot about it. I just told myself I had almost been lost and to be more careful. Flash forward many years to now, and I still hike. At this point, Max is very old and no longer hikes with me, so it's just me and Bo. Last year, I hiked up to a cave behind my house, as I've done a million times before. And then I started following a trail I'd never fully explored, just out of curiosity. Bo was ahead of me, per usual, but when I called her back, she'd come. We hiked for the better part of 45 minutes, following a pretty simple trail, and then I figured I'd better be heading back because it'd be getting dark soon. And yet, I couldn't stop. I kept telling myself I'd go just a little bit farther and see just a little bit more. I remember looking down at my feet, just like before, listening to the silence of the woods around me, and feeling at peace. It felt so easy to just keep going deeper and so difficult to turn around. Bo felt the call, too, because even after I did break out of it and turn around, only after stumbling on a root, and then called back to her, she wouldn't stop. I had to catch up with her, physically turn her around, and pet her before she'd come with me. This happened a long time ago. I was in my mid-teens at the time, and due to unusual circumstances, my dad had woken me up in the middle of the night to walk the dog with him and have a chat. It was around 2 a.m. It was a full moon and a very bright night with great visibility. The skies were clear, and we were walking on a granite hill, an extinct volcano in fact, that has a valley in the middle with a loch-in, small lake, in it. We had walked around the loch-in before starting up the side of the valley towards the ridge with the dog on a leash. As we began to approach the top of the slope, the dog stopped dead and refused to come any further in the direction we were walking. He was literally a dead weight on the leash, and we would have had to bodily drag him to move him even an inch further forward. We realized that he'd tucked his tail between his legs, was visibly shaking, and was in a curled crouch, making himself as small as possible. He was also entirely fixated on something ahead of us that we hadn't noticed or paid attention to beforehand. It appeared to be a straight black line emerging vertically from the ground. I remember thinking at first that it was a plastic tube they used to protect vulnerable saplings from deer because, in the first moments we became aware of it, there were no discernible features whatsoever other than a black vertical bar. As we watched, the straight black bar unfurled into the crude shape of a humanoid, which I estimate to have been around 8 feet tall. Unfurled is the best term I can think of to describe this process. If you've ever seen a butterfly emerge from a chrysalis, it was something like that. The figure was entirely jet black, there were no visible features or contrast within it to any degree despite the bright moonlight, and black doesn't cover how dark this thing actually was. It was what I imagine a black hole might look like, and although the figure itself wasn't remotely transparent or insubstantial, the outline was slightly fuzzy or blurred, almost like something that's vibrating extremely quickly or a washing machine on a high spin cycle. It did not have human proportions, it was almost like a child's drawing of a stick man, but with disproportionately long arms and legs. If you are imagining something like a stick insect made out of the material vantablack and in the rough shape of a person, you're close to the mark. The head was unusually small, and I remember the top of the head being somewhat flat, although my dad doesn't. In every other respect, our recollections of the event are identical. This all happened within probably under a minute, and then it turned and faced us. I'm not going to give a melodramatic description, and in fact, words can't really do it justice, but, although it lacked any features whatsoever that might be identified as eyes or a face, you could feel this thing's attention on you. Instantly, every hair on my body stood erect, and I broke out in goosebumps. I turned to my dad and said, "Dad, what the F is that thing?" He's one of the most skeptical and level-headed people I know, so what really freaked me out was that his answer was just, "I don't know, we need to get out of here right now," and as a young man, being able to detect genuine fear in my dad's voice was itself quite unsettling. We immediately began to walk sideways away from the figure so as not to entirely turn our backs on it, and the minute we began moving away, it was like a spell was broken on the dog, who began to literally drag us. The figure followed us for more than 5 minutes, maintaining the same distance. It walked with large, slow, deliberate strides, and I remember its arms swung in long arcs as it moved. At no point did it show any sign of aggression, it simply followed, maintaining the same distance from us the entire time. It was perfectly and completely silent, there wasn't a sound when it was following us. We were in a highly adrenalized state during this pursuit, and the atmosphere was extremely tense. We exchanged very few words other than whispers like, "Is it still following us? And don't look at it." It never even crossed our minds to run, which, in hindsight, seems unusual given that neither of us even entertains the possibility that this was just another person out for a walk. In the moment, we both had an almost literally overhilarating sense of wrongness about the situation. After about 5 minutes, I stopped. I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was something along the lines of, "This is completely insane. What the F is going on? What is that effing thing?" And when we stopped, it stopped, and again just turned to stand facing us straight on. Because of the total lack of features, it may as well have been facing directly away from us, but, like I said, there was a very definite physical sense of when this awareness was focused on you. We stood in total silence. The dog continued trying to drag us away. It stood motionless for a minute or two, and then, as we watched, it turned, sank down into the solid ground, and disappeared. Immediately, it felt like some sort of charge in the air had dissipated, and we began power walking back to the car. When we got back, we were still buzzing with adrenaline, and we woke everyone up to tell them what we'd seen. This happened about 2 years ago in the summer, shortly after the 4th of July at Clingman's Dome. It is the highest peak in the Great Smokies National Park. My husband had been hounding for everyone to go there, me and 2 sons, ages 6 and 8, at the time. We were not going to stay overnight, we just went to check out the summit viewing deck. For those who have never been there, the viewing deck has 2, maybe more, ways you can get to it. The most common way and the way we took it was to drive in, park, then take the about a mile hike to the deck. It is super easy and also super busy, depending on the time of year, and it is also paved. We go, get up there, take some really amazing photos, and hang out for a little bit. Now here is where, in hindsight, things started to get weird. My youngest child has epilepsy and a migraine disorder, has been seizure-free for 2.5 years, and has headaches controlled by medication. As we were going back, he started to complain that he felt really hot and that his head hurt. On the dome, it is cold because of the high altitude. We were all needing long sleeves, and it felt more like November than summer. I tell my husband and other child I'm going to carry him the rest of the way, and me, being the out-of-shape person I am, would meet them at the car if I got behind or had to take it slow, which I was sure I would from carrying 50 pounds of child. I didn't want to ruin their fun day and figured I would sit in the car with the AC blowing on little one and give him some migraine rescue meds, and that while we rested, my husband and son could finish exploring. I made a half-assed joke about sending the Rangers in to find us if I didn't make it back to the car shortly after they did because I'm in shit shape and may need to be golf carted out. They went ahead but were still in sight, maybe a few hundred feet, I'm not too sure. At this point, maybe it was a lull in the visitor levels, but there were no other people I could see in front of us or coming down behind us. My little one starts to cry and says that both his ears and head hurt now too, and he was covering his ears. At this point, the weight of him was breaking my arms off, so I put him down and told him we were going to sit down and rest for a few minutes. We walked off the paved trail and sat down at the edge of the tree line or grass line, and I told him to close his eyes and just relax and lay down on the cool grass beside me. We were almost to the car, etc. I got my phone out to text my husband that we were resting, and I noticed it was silent because my text click sounded so loud. No wind, not a ducking thing. It was like someone pressed pause on the area, or that the forest was holding its breath would be another way to describe it. My mother is a paranoid whack job about tornadoes. She grew up in Illinois, so rightly so, and spent years pounding it into my head as a child that there is a calm before the storm thing that happens and to take cover because it will be a tornado touching down despite that never happening here. So that was my first thought, holy SHT, a tornado is about to happen because everything just went dead. My kid is now curled up beside me, whimpering that he is scared, his ears hurt, make it stop, and he wants to go home. I swear to you, it felt like his little voice was the voice of a god. That is how silent the place was. By now, the hair on my neck is standing up, and it is just a general sick feeling I'm getting, like a tornado is about to begin and suck us up. I actually started to feel afraid to look around me and focused on my kid, calming him down. At this point, the area had this ominous, heavy feeling. I can't explain that one either, almost like I was afraid to look because I wouldn't like what I would see, like when you're a kid and you were afraid to look under your bed at night or something. I know it sounds insane. So we had been there for about 10 minutes or so when I got myself semi-together and had a really strong, almost primal urge to get the hell out and down the trail. I picked up my still crying kid and literally ran the rest of the way. When we got there, my husband and other child were nowhere to be found. He had the keys, so we had to wait. At this point, only our car and 2 others were still there. I assumed those 2 were on another, less easy trail, so I let the little one sit on the hood and prepared for the wait. At this point, I was still feeling leftover heebie-jeebies from the creepy quiet where we rested off the trail, but my kid was no longer complaining about his ears or his head. A few seconds later, my oldest son comes racing down from the same freaking trail we just came from with a look of sheer panic on his face before he turns his head and starts screaming that he found mom and brother. He was followed by my husband, not even a minute later. My other son had been visibly crying, and my husband immediately started screaming at us about where the hell we have been and if we are okay. I asked him what his issue was and told him that I sent him a text saying we were resting for a little while off the edge of the trail. Now here is what made my blood run cold. He told me they had been looking for us for over 3 hours. I called him a liar, and it probably just felt like hours. I said we were resting for about 10 minutes, but after checking my phone, his phone, and even the clock in the car, it turned out that we really had been gone for about 3.5 hours. Besides this, my husband and other child said they had gone up and down the paved trail to the viewing deck 3 or 4 times while calling mine and my little son's names. This would have been impossible to miss because sound carries an extreme level in that area. You could yell and hear it a mile away. I promptly turned and asked my little son if he still needed his migraine medicine, and he said the noise making his head hurt was gone and he was fine now. My husband asked him what the noise was, and he said it sounded like a big bumblebee inside his head. We hauled out of there as fast as we could, all the while explaining every detail to my husband, who basically told me to shut up until we got home and could talk away from the kids. Needless to say, we haven't been back to that area again, and my husband is no longer a fan of the woods like he used to be either. When I was a freshman in college, attending JCC in Watertown, New York, I had an obsession with chasing the legends of the area, Tug Hill Annie, the haunted abandoned dairy mill in Evans Mills, but this particular one was a little closer to home, and I managed to sucker one of my poor roommates into going with me because she was terrified of me going alone. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Watertown, but one of its best urban legends is the Thompson Park time vortex. The park was only about 4 miles away from my school. There are dozens of stories, some online and some from the locals, and pretty much anyone I asked knew someone with a story, but the ones that had piqued my interest were of a little girl who had gone on a class trip, gotten lost for 3 days, and was later found in the park looking for her teacher as if no time had passed, and one of a woman and her boyfriend walking in the park, with the boyfriend disappearing in front of her only to be found in another section a few hours later. I was pretty curious from the get-go, and I asked around and did a little research into some possible explanations. I found everything from the founder was a Satanist who performed animal sacrifices there with a cult all the way to the park sits on top of a few large deposits of copper, quartz, and limestone, and it makes the EMF crazy, distorting perception. Being as curious as I am, I just decided to go and look for myself, maybe finding an answer to my own questions. One of my roommates, whom we're going to just call B, came with me. We decided to walk the 4 miles because hiding my car didn't seem like a possibility, and the park officially closed at 9 p.m. We got there around 8:30 after a long day of classes and started poking around. It's not like we knew what we were looking for at all, so we really just wandered for a few minutes, until I noticed a hiking path that had been chained off. Well, if you're going to trespass, go all the way, right? B was pretty adamant that we not go down that way, and I probably should have listened, but nobody could tell 18-year-old me anything, especially when I had already made up my mind. So she follows me over the chain and into what could only be described as the most cliché horror film imaginable. It wasn't noticeable at first, but the further in we got, the darker it got. The trail must have been closed for a while because the trees were so thick that there was absolutely no light, not even from the moon. When it got to the point that it was noticeable, we got nervous. When we really couldn't see 6 inches in front of our faces, we agreed that I would take the lead with my phone light, and B would turn her phone off and save the battery in case something went really wrong. When I turned my light on, my stomach dropped. There was something wrong with the tree. They were twisted and covered in cancerous-looking knots. We stared a little too long, and B pointed out that some of them could almost be faces. We stopped pointing the light up. It got worse the further we went into the woods. It was so horrifyingly quiet, no wind, no rustling. The only sound was our feet squelching in the mud, and then the squelching got worse, and we realized it was because the ground was covered in what must have been a few thousand night crawlers. We walked for at least 20 minutes without taking a single step that didn't crush at least 10 of the goddamn worms, and that was the only sound other than the occasional conversation to figure out which of the many paths we should take to get out. Eventually, it got so muddy that the paths just sort of stopped. Overall, we were lost for about 45 minutes to an hour before I finally gave up on the paths and just plowed through the trees trying to get us out, because by this point B was getting upset and I was well past anxious. We were 2 teenage girls under 5 feet 6 inches lost in the dark woods at night, like some kind of B-list, first-person horror flick. We came out at the golf course somehow, and after we stopped at the restroom there to pee, well, I did anyway, and ran from the local skunk that must have lived there, we managed to find our way back to a path that took us back to the main park area. We had only been there an hour and a half at most, maybe even 2, but when B turned her phone back on, it was a little after 3 in the morning. We had lost almost 5 hours between arriving and finding our way back to the entrance. We looked at one another and had our holy shit dude moment before we came back down to earth and decided it was time to get the hell out of Dodge. The way to the entrance is across from us, through the picnic area. We were about to head out the main way when a motorcycle flashing red and blue lights came around the corner for a lap. We did not know that the park had security, but given how often people must have snuck in after hours looking for the vortex, I probably should have known better. We waited until he wasn't facing us and sprinted to the restroom area, hiding there and waiting for him to pass us again. We tried to keep to the shadows like we were ninjas instead of stupid kids being where they shouldn't, which is laughable now, but we were terrified of being caught. We ran like hell up the road, climbing up the rock ledge and using that to stay above the winding path down to the main entrance. We climbed down when we ran out of ridge, and thinking we were in the clear, we started meandering down the road and laughing at ourselves. Apparently we hadn't been as slick as we'd thought, because a light started peeking around the corner of the curved road, and in a panic, with nowhere to hide, we threw ourselves into the bushes and shrubs to our right. I guess the guard had radioed his coworker because a security car was creeping up the hill. It almost stopped, about 4 feet in front of where we were lying in the mud and sticks, before it decided to keep going. My heart was in my throat, and all the color had drained from B's face. We had both been thinking that we were caught and so close to getting out. When we finally gathered the courage to get up, we booked it down and out as fast as we could. I don't know what happened to us, but there is something wrong with that place. I never found that trail we took on any map, and neither one of us could ever explain what happened to those 5 hours in the woods. I never did get another chance to try and prove one way or another, but I know one thing for a fact, those stories have some truth to them. There is something going on at Thompson Park. So, there's this thing that I, a few years ago, started to look into. It's when people are walking in the woods and then suddenly just divert from the path, walk out into the woods, and disappear. This in itself doesn't sound that weird. The weird part is that these disappearances happen at the same spot on the path. This isn't isolated to a single place in the world, however, but can be found in woods all around the globe. One of these areas is said to be located in the woods near where I grew up. And there are a few stories about it, like someone just stopping and turning to the other person, telling them, "I have to go," and then just turning and walking straight out into the woods. Some people apparently have been stopped by people that were with them, and they appear to be in some kind of trance-like state. And when they get out of this state, they have no recollection of what's happened. Like I've said, I started to do some small research regarding this a few years ago. I only stopped because I started at university and had to focus on school. A few months ago, I got curious and started to ask around about this again. Only now can I find anything on it. No links, no stories. Nothing. The only other person I can find who knows about this is my friend, who also did some research with me on the subject. It's just odd that I could find loads of information on the subject a few years ago, but now I can't find anything, and no one knows what I'm talking about. My question is, basically, does anyone know anything about this? Anything at all would be helpful. I know the text might be jumpy or confusing. So don't hesitate to ask questions. I just want to clear this up and try to understand. Starting off, I grew up as a hardcore atheist and non-believer in the paranormal. Even the thought of ET life forms with technology capable of light-speed travel seemed far-fetched and improbable. God seemed impossible, and if God did exist according to scripture, I felt like he was a being without good morals. Around 2017, I became more of an agnostic who shattered his ideals of absolution but still needed evidence for proof. I don't claim to know what could or could not be out there anymore. All I know is that the possibility remains. My father lives off Highway 44 between St. James and Cuba, Missouri. For several years now, he has had strange events and sightings at his house and in his area. Going back to 2018 is when I first felt off. My father and my brother were all out at the pole barn late at night, roughly 10 p.m., doing work on my father's truck. We normally have some type of firearm nearby when outside. As I was smoking a cigarette outside of the pole barn, I felt really uneasy. Nothing had happened out of the ordinary, but I felt like I was being watched by someone with a scope on my forehead. The neighbors live about a quarter mile down the road on one side of my father's house. And on the other side is an open field. In front of the house is the road with the woods on the other side of the road, and behind the house is about 4 acres of land stretching all in a square that is mostly open with scattered trees, with the forest being the edge of the property. I felt like the threat was coming from the woods behind the house. I told my father and brother, but they felt fine. He told me if I felt off, to shoot several slugs in that direction. So I shot 3 slugs off into the woods. I didn't hear anything move from being frightened, but the feeling persisted for about another 10 minutes or so. I figured I was psyching myself out and didn't think much of the situation. This happened near late summer or early fall, I believe. Nearly a year later, in mid-July, I went back down there. This time, my father instructed me to listen for a sound. It was nearly inaudible. It sounded like a heartbeat coming from the floor of his house. It was only possible to hear it if everything was dead silent and your head was near the floor. Nothing shook, but the sound was so consistent that it persisted at all times of the day and for several months. I would ask him if it was still happening when I left, and he would always tell me yes until about October, I believe. It was odd, to say the least, but it never made me feel unsafe. However, in September, I went down there for a weekend and had one of the scariest encounters of my life. I felt like a small child who wanted to cry for help. My father, my brother, their dog, and my cousin all went to town. So instead of sleeping on the couch, I went to sleep in my father's room. It was roughly 8 to 10 a.m. when I went to sleep on his king-sized memory foam mattress. I don't know how much time had passed when I fell back to sleep, but I was suddenly woken from my slumber when I felt the bed slightly move. I figured the dog had jumped up, but I was so tired that I didn't even open my eyes. Seconds later, the bed violently rose and slammed up and down for what seemed to be about 10 to 30 seconds. Scared out of my mind, I was still paralyzed. I didn't hear anything other than the bed slamming and the box fan being swept across the floor. As soon as it stopped, I opened my eyes and looked around the small room. There was the closet near the door that was closed and the door that was cracked open, which is not unusual. Afraid to move for nearly 20 to 40 minutes, I just sat there. I was hoping nothing was in the closet. I grabbed the shotgun near the bed and opened up the closet, and it was empty. I then checked the rest of the house. Some open windows with the screen still in and both doors leading outside bolted locked. I proceeded to look up if an earthquake happened. And for the next few days, I didn't see anything as such reported. I coughed it up to me having a seizure, which I had when I was younger, but even that idea didn't make sense because the box fan had been moved nearly 5 feet and was on the floor facing down. My family returned after this incident about 2 hours later, and I kept silent because I forced myself to believe it was a seizure. Nearly 2 years later, in 2021, the unexplained phenomenon started to happen on an almost weekly basis. My brother moved out, so the only 2 people who noticed it were me when I was down there and my father. He started off the conversation when I arrived there one Friday night with, "I am not on drugs, but I need your eye to tell me if I'm going insane." Since I was more open-minded at this time, I agreed to listen and look at what he wanted to show me. It was nearly 11 p.m., and he instructed me to shut off his lights in his room. What I saw was a silhouetted humanoid figure that would almost leave traces of itself as it would walk between 2 different trees in the backyard. From point A to point B, however, at point B, the figure would basically teleport back to point A and repeat the cycle. It also happened in my brother's room, except the figure would seemingly disappear and reappear behind multiple different trees, but still in a pattern. I honestly thought my father's eyes and my eyes were playing tricks on us, and I was feeding off his delusions. Until I saw a light flashing in the woods. It looked yellowish orange, but it flickered 3 times right at the house in 3-second intervals that would slowly fade down. He didn't see it at that time, nor did he tell me about it. But when I told him what I had just seen, it was as if I had just confirmed his fears. He said he had also seen lights in the same area of the woods. We both covered our windows that night with blackout sheets and slept with a firearm next to our bed. I would also hear almost stomping sounds in the attic late at night, almost any time I was down there for a 2 to 3 day period, at least once. We were too scared to check, so we just ignored it. I've also seen rusted metal illuminate green, which is highly odd. As for the first time I saw the shadows, before I convinced myself they were real, I coughed up multiple ideas as to what was causing them. Maybe it was the moon in the clouds? Nope, it was a new moon, and there was a single cloud in the sky. Maybe it was something like a bird, bat, or bug flying around the pole lights? The pole lights did not reach the edge of the woods, and the silhouette was so dark that it was as if some mass had to be right there. These are all my first-hand accounts. I have several other accounts I could add to these, but it could just be more of a coincidence than actual strange occurrences. I'm currently 26 years old and male, with perfect eyesight. I'm slightly overweight at 5 feet 7 inches, weighing in at 210 pounds. I don't scare easily. Nor do I usually believe in the supernatural. My father's first-hand accounts. I don't know his timeline, BTW. Things he claimed he had seen and heard. Translucent humanoids, a chappy robot-like figure in a meat suit, strange lights that could not be from a vehicle, black shadowy figures and one white misty-looking figure, a giant black cougar, something saying help in his woods and also saying hello, taps on his windows at all hours of the night, screeching sounds Hess never heard before, along with 2 different creatures howling like the ones in the Hulu show The 411 Missing the Hunted. Sometimes his vehicle will be dead when he goes to start it in the morning, along with some of my family members. This past spring 2022, my father was out during the day near his tree line foraging for mushrooms and deer antlers when his dog, a fully grown full-blooded pit bull weighing in at nearly 50 to 60 pounds, was kicked nearly 10 to 15 feet into a tree. He heard the dog yell, and he was limping all the way back to the house. He swears he didn't hurt the dog. I believe him, considering the dog didn't show anything but love for him after he was hurt and wouldn't stray into the woods any longer. My family thought it was my father who hurt the dog. However, if my dad were to hurt the dog, I believe he would have just shot it. And he would have only shot him if the dog were severely sick or trying to kill him. The dog is tamed and only shows aggression towards strangers. It's literally his only friend since me and my brother no longer live with him. When they go to town with him, they leave him in the truck because he is literally the best guard dog I have ever seen. Don't worry, they only leave him in there for several minutes, and the windows are cracked. This past winter, in January or February 2022, my father heard knocking on his window around 5 or 6 a.m. Someone was trying to break in, so he went outside with his shotgun and his dog. When inspecting the side of the house, he claims he was pushed or thrown 5 or 6 feet backward, spraining his hands. He grabbed the dog, got in his car, left his gun, and left for another relative's house for a day. His hand was severely swollen, and he was having trouble lifting just a cup of water. Returning to his house the next day, he saw his imprint on the snow. He was thrown forward, and no tracks other than his were visible. The gun was right there, where he fell. While he was hunting in the winter, he was in his tree stand. As he was sitting there in the blistering cold with snow all around him, he heard snow crunching as if something was stepping there. When he looked down, he saw no tracks and no sign of any creatures. He was paralyzed with fear, like I was, because he swears he saw something almost identical to the predator. Some nights he claims his woods will illuminate even though it's a new moon. Other nights, his motion sensor floodlights will turn off and on even though there is nothing out there. At some point, the floodlights just stay on and don't go off for hours. At 7 a.m. this morning, he witnessed something that looked like a Bigfoot. October 2, 2022. He was going along the trail in the back of his house with his AKM when he heard something jingle, like a collar, but the dog was inside. Then he claims he heard some type of odd music. He thought he was hallucinating. Then he noticed a creature roughly 8 feet tall, weighing 450 pounds, with what looked to be muscle and long black hair, just walking towards him, and it was only about 15 to 20 feet away. He was walking backwards once he noticed it, and it kept following. He let off 25 RD 7.62 by 39 at this thing, and he claims he was shooting for its chest and not a single bullet made contact. Each one seemed to phase right through it like it was a hologram. Finally making his way back out of the woods and to the pole barn, the creature finally stopped at the tree line. Never running or making any kind of sound. He went back inside the house and grabbed my grandmother. I had her look at this thing, and she claims she saw a tall, black, shadowy figure just standing in the tree line. She's around 84 years old and doesn't have the best eyesight, but she claims she saw something. My father was so scared when he first saw it that he doesn't even remember what its face looked like. He had his iron sights pointed at the chest of the creature the whole time. He has had other strange occurrences near him, but I cannot recall them in great enough detail. Strange occurrences in a 10-mile radius. The man who owns the open field next to my father's house had 3 cattle mutilated in a 2-day span. Their throats are coated with a precision-like tool. The cattle are friendly if you are on the outside of the fence. I have fed them apples and veggies before. However, if you cross the fence, the cattle will chase you out. Knowing the owner, he gave my father permission to check on the property from time to time, but the cows continuously chased him out. I'm not sure how someone or something could stop them from getting chased out and performing precision cuts, killing the animals. I do not know if any organs were missing. However, from what I heard, it looked like they were just needlessly killed. When they asked my father if he had noticed anything strange, he denied all the claims. He doesn't want to sound like a nut job or if people think he's a drug addict hallucinating. Down the street, about 10 miles, is another couple who owns chickens. They are down to earth, and I have hung with them several times. They are older, in their late 50s, and in August, something killed their chickens in the locked coop, taking only the heads. Putting the chicken corpses in a circle inside the coop, all without breaking or removing them, is what we have seen. Another individual claims to have heard the odd howling and screeching too. And something with the weight of a human or more land on his trailer. He said he looked out his window looking for anything strange, and when he got near, he saw something with a 15-20 foot wingspan take off. I honestly don't know what to think about all this. Other than my own accounts, I typically don't believe much other than the facts. However, all these strange occurrences cannot be coincidences. I'm completely lost on what the facts might even be anymore. I'm really scared of going down there anymore, even with a firearm. I would love to hear some ideas about how to capture some photo evidence that does not require the internet. He had deer cameras out there, but they no longer power on even if you replace the power source. Has anyone had similar experiences? Any help or thoughts would be greatly appreciated. I feel like typing all this down makes me sound insane. And honestly, I understand why my father doesn't tell his neighbors now. I literally just talk about strange lights and shadow people, the predator, my bed being violently shaken by an unknown force, big feet, and more. I swear, I feel like I'm in a terrible movie script.